Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be at a Rotary Club meeting. I actually found one of the things I missed the most about being a Rotarian were the jokes. I love the sense of humor. We would always have great jokes in our club as well, and all of the good things that you're doing. I made a comment to Bob that reminding us of where the Rotary money goes is really helpful. Service above self, and just knowing that so many people are having their lives changed with the work that you do. One of the other great things, of course, about Rotary is the chance to have discussion, the chance to speak about important issues. I'm really sorry that I missed Mark Chamberlain last week. Mark and I have had chances to work on a lot of different initiatives in Hamilton, and he's a great speaker, and I understand he gave a compelling case for LRT in the community. So I'm sorry that I missed Mark, but I'm really pleased to be here today to have the opportunity to speak to you. And actually, it was 12 years ago, around this time, I believe, that I spoke to this club when you were over at the Royal Connaught. I don't know how many of you were members back then, but I was asked at the time to speak as a new executive director of an organization called Safe Communities. I had worked as a reporter anchor for CBC Television, had a car accident, was hired to start an injury prevention initiative here in Hamilton, and came to the club to speak about that. And I remember having a wonderful reception back then. Since that time, as was mentioned, I've had the opportunity to do a few things. I ran the Oakville Chamber of Commerce for a number of years and have a national PR firm that, while we're based in Hamilton with our office down on King William now, get a chance to be all over the country and see a lot of interesting things. But one of the things that keeps bringing me back to Hamilton any chance I get is building this community. So 12 years ago when I spoke about Safe Communities, it was about building the community in that capacity. Why I'm here today is Richard, who I've worked with for years on different things, saw a letter to the editor that I wrote to the Hamilton Spectator 2 weeks ago imploring council to work on having a more sustainable vision for our city. Every year or so I get a little riled up and write a letter to the editor. I think the last one was on Pan Am about a year ago, and this time it was just around what looked to be some equivocation around LRT. I won't speak about the merits of LRT. Mark Chamberlain has done that much better than I ever could, but I was compelled to write and say we need to have a little more focus as a city. We can't be seen to be sending out mixed messages when it comes to something as important as our future. So when I was asked to speak here today, Richard said, "What do you want to talk about, Laura?" I said, well, why don't we talk about building community? Because that's what we essentially all have in common. We want social justice. We want a better life, better standard of living, better well-being for everyone in our community. We want to bring the disenfranchised in. That's one of the values of Rotary, the idea of service. And when I went on your website just to check it out, I noticed that one of your flash icons up in the corner is actually building community. It's a slogan that you use here as Rotarians. So what is building community, and how is it changing in Hamilton? Where is it at now? What's the opportunity? I'm going to take us through a little bit of a retrospective from my vantage point of the last 10 years and what's been happening in terms of building our community. And then I want to talk to you about what the opportunity is going forward, especially regarding the media and new media, which is something that I'm very involved in. When you think about community building, it wasn't certainly something that I planned to do. I know a number of you in this room probably had a real hand in actually building our city over the years. I was just a reporter running some organizations, never thought I'd get in the business of community building. But there's something compelling about Hamilton, isn't there? You know, not everybody in their community works hard to build it, but all of you do, and Hamiltonians really do. And I'll tell you a quick story. When I first moved to Hamilton, I wasn't native to Hamilton, I'd lived all over the place. Within about a month or so, had been asked to volunteer on a television show called Primetime Forum with the venerable Ken Peters from The Spectator. And we would get on the air, live TV, kind of yell at each other about municipal issues. It was a lot of fun every Thursday night. I'd only been doing the show a little while. My parents had come to visit me. I was in college here in town, here a few months. And we were having dinner on a Sunday night. I was trying to impress my parents with my new apartment, all that stuff. And the phone rings. And it's the mayor's office calling me on a Sunday evening. And this got to be a joke. And the person said, "No, Laura, the mayor wants you to call him right now." So I thought, wow, that's crazy. So I called the mayor at home, and it was Bob Morrow, and he wanted to give me a good tongue lashing about comments that I'd made on the air on this TV show a few days prior. I guess he'd just seen the repeat that broadcast on Sundays. And I got off the phone with him, wonderful to have that kind of focus from the mayor, and I said to my parents, wow, what a community. The fact that the mayor is calling some nobody like me to talk and to persuade me on the merits of Hamilton. And as I was thinking about this story, ironically, maybe 10 years later, so a couple of years ago, Bob Morrow left me a voicemail thanking me for my community building efforts, just out of the blue. And I thought, he's not in office anymore. He doesn't need to do that kind of thing. but he was so passionate about Hamilton. You might have liked his leadership or not, but the passion about Hamilton I found was so compelling. You know, in community building, there's really 4 steps to build a community, to get people together. The first step is something called pseudo-community, which is where people are essentially faking it. They're being polite, they're not really investing of themselves, they're not really being honest, they're not really putting their heart out there. Hamilton, in my estimation, has never suffered from pseudo-community. There is nobody involved in this community who keeps things to themselves. It is a very dynamic experience. Sometimes, as Terry Cook often said, Hamilton politics, they're firing with live rounds. It's like a blood sport in this community. But that's passion, and that's exciting, and that's good. And that's one of the things that drew me to Hamilton. The second stage to community building is something called chaos. And that's where, just like it sounds, people aren't listening to each other, people are yelling at each other, and the divergence of opinions is stopping building from happening. I think we experienced that with Pan Am, and I think we experienced it in spades. If you travel, as I do, you would have seen the effects of the Pan Am process were more damaging on the city than needed to be. I was doing a national television show one morning last summer, and there was a new DJ in a big Toronto sports station, and he was on the political panel with me. And he said, "You're from Hamilton?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Oh, man, I love it. Every day I'm going to beat on you guys for how you're handling Pan Am." And I thought, of all the stuff we do in this community, why is this happening to us? It's because we stay in that chaos phase a bit too much. A lot of talking, a lot of anger, a lot of entrenched positions, not a lot of getting together. If you look at 50 years on a road, for instance, that we spent, you look at the current debates that are happening around things like the airport lands, LRT, it's essential to have debate in community building. But the challenge is, how do we move past what seems to be chaos to the next phase? And the next phase is called emptiness, ironically, where people kind of empty themselves of control of the process. I'm a control freak. That's a difficult thing for me to embrace, but I understand it as essential now. You have to step back and say, what are we all going for here, and do I need to control how this works, how things are said, how things are done? Richard and I were talking just prior to the speech today, and I was telling him a little bit about this, and he said, how do we move through that? And I said, well, I think that there is real signs of that emptiness phase coming so that we can come together as a community. And I'll tell you what those are in just a moment. But that's what community building is all about. So let's look at some of the efforts that we've done as a city over the last 10 years. I started to think about it, and I'm sure a number of ideas are popping into your mind now. We've had so many initiatives as a city. We're trying very hard. We've had, think about them with me, Vision 2020, the triple bottom line approach for council, grids. We had amalgamation, the transition board, which was quite a project to undergo. We have had the Jobs Prosperity Collaborative, the Civic Coalition prior to that, the Economic Summit, which of course Richard is involved in. So many things, the prayer breakfast. We do so many things as a community, the Hamilton Centre for Civic Inclusion, and the list goes on and on and on. If you've ever done the walk on James Street North, the art crawl, I went on that for the first time and couldn't believe it. It was like being in Europe for a night. There were thousands of people on the street from all over. I saw clients from other cities who were there. So there are so many things happening in Hamilton that we've tried to do to build community. And they're meeting with different levels of success. We've also tried to build community through slogans. So yesterday, I put out on Twitter, I went to what's called a hashtag, put the word Hamilton with a number sign, and I said, "Hamilton, help me out here. Remind me of all of the vision statements or slogans the city's had since we got started." And I think we're a small enough group here today that I'm going to actually put this question to you. Who can tell me any of the slogans or the vision statements that the city has put forth in the past? Marvin, you're a ringer on this, so I'll make you wait for a moment. Anybody else remember any of them? The ambitious city, always number one, the one I've heard more than anything else. What else? Lunch Bucket City. I don't know that we ever made that a slogan, but that's certainly a stereotype. What else? Yes, that was Bob Wade's slogan around the time of amalgamation. And what's interesting is if you drive, as we do, take our kids on a Sunday afternoon drive every week outside of the original city into the amalgamated city, that's the sign you see everywhere when you come from any area. Interesting, because it's 12 years old and most people don't jump to it, but we still have that out there, city of many communities. What else? Yes, Reach, Dream, Rise and Shine, my least favorite of all, because I remember the press conference for that at the Chamber of Commerce, and it was children dancing in like a daisy field. And I thought, what does this have to do with Hamilton? and not that we don't have beautiful parks, we do, but why not focus, say, on, Chris Eklund will love me for this, on our waterfalls. It's something we actually have as opposed to daisy fields. But one of the things with a good slogan is you look at what's called your USP, your unique selling proposition, what sets you apart from everybody else, and then the value proposition, why should anybody care about that? So the reach, dream, rise, shine, inspirational, but wasn't one of my favorites, but good on remembering that. Anybody else? Any others? City of Waterfalls, that's one certainly that Chris Eklund is working very hard to get out there, because we do, I think, have the most waterfalls in North America because of the lovely escarpment. Anything else? The Steel City and the Hammer, right? Those are names that have been given to us that I don't think we're going to get out of. Manchester of Canada, because of our industry. I hadn't heard that before. What about, does anybody know the last two mayors, what their vision statements were for the city? Larry Deanny, anybody? His was invest in Hamilton. And how about Mayor Eisenberger? You might know this one, Richard. I don't want to put you too much on the spot. Best place to raise a child is the one that maybe Mark invoked in his speech last week. And the current administration, the current council, the current mayor, any ideas? That's a trick question. As far as I'm aware, there isn't one currently. So the point that I'm making with Hamilton is that we have had a number of different visions, some of them packed into slogans, all around the idea of trying to build community. In the focus group I did and in this conversation, maybe the only one that is really stuck is the ambitious city. That's certainly something that I've heard more than any other since I moved here. A slogan is not going to build a community. A slogan is not going to change our economic fortunes. But if it's part of a strategy where things are followed with a vision, it can make a difference. And so I just put that exercise out for you as community leaders to see where your heads are and what you recall about that. So we've tried a number of things, and some of those things that I mentioned, Poverty Roundtable, the Jobs Prosperity Collaborative, a number of them are doing great work. And I think as a citizenry, we are engaged. We are community builders. But I want to talk to you today about how that's changing. Because one thing that all of you know who are successful in your business and your field of endeavor, you can't stay static. Things can't stay the same. The same approach doesn't continue to work. And I've had 2 children recently and been traveling a lot with my company as well, so I felt as though I wasn't in Hamilton enough. And I wanted to get more engaged and understand what's really happening in terms of the local community building situation. So I did 2 things. One was to get very involved in social media, and I'm going to talk to you about that in a minute because I think it's important for all of you. And the other was to start an experiment where I just selected the different people in the community I thought were interesting, leaders, some political, some business, some social activists, some just engaged citizens, some bloggers, some actors. I invited them into a conversation. Did it like an old school radio program, microphones, lounge chairs, private setting. And what came out of those discussions was more than I ever imagined. And it was something that I want to bring up today because it showed me that in Hamilton, whether it's talking to Larry Deanny or Marie Boutriani or Richard Coruscant or Marvin Ryder or the writer for the editor of the Raise the Hammer blog, Ryan McGreal, activist Matt Jelly, whomever I've spoken to in the last couple of months, PJ Mercanti, the list goes on, you'd probably know all of them. They all want to get past the chaos phase. And they all want to start to empty and get towards the actual community building. Why? Because it's in nobody's best interest when we don't move forward. It's in nobody's best interest when we don't change how we do things. And so these little radio interviews that I did that are online, they weren't meant to solve any problems or build any community. It was just me wanting to get back in touch with what's really happening in town. But what I found was probably best summarized by the editor of Raise the Hammer, a gentleman by the name of Ryan McGreal. Computer programmer, young man, I don't know if you've ever met him. I had a certain stereotype about what I thought he was all about. I thought he was kind of an anti-establishment activist. Brought him in, sat down, talked to him, realized he was an educated, passionate person who lives here with his young family, saw the cycling championships and how the city could feel, and decided to dedicate every moment of his time to it. So I said to him, how do you do this? How do you publish this online newsletter that has 10,000 readers? How are you always in The Spectator? How do you lead the community the way that you do with your family and everything else? And he said, I don't watch TV, Laura. Who's got the time? I have to be involved. I'm passionate. And you will have seen a lot of his editorials recently on the LRT. So when I talked to Ryan, he said something that stuck with me. And I've put this to every guest I've had in since. He said, you know what? I'm looking for the overlap now. I'm looking for the overlap. Because I asked him, how can you work with people when you've been so divided on issues? LRT, Aerotropolis, all these things. He said, now I'm looking for the overlap. And so when I had Matt Jelly, you might know of him as well, another community activist, ran for Ward 2. He was there, and he had had a lot of fights on a lot of issues with a lot of people, myself included. And I said, Matt, how do we as a community build this better? And he said, you know what? I'm learning. I'm learning something valuable. And he told me that, you remember Red Hill, of course, and you'll recall that there were protesters who were living in the trees trying to stop the highway. It was pretty contentious. Matt was one of those people feeding the protesters, bringing them up food on ropes. And he fought it. The day that the Red Hill opened, Larry Deaney, the mayor, put Matt in the car, drove him on an inaugural drive down the Red Hill. And he said, Matt, because of your protest, we now have a better road, we've got this habitat, we've got this, we've won international awards. And Matt said, wow, I've realized that if we are looking to work together, we can come up with a better city, a better product. There doesn't have to be that level of chaos. And so here are activists, engaged citizens, mayors, business leaders, all wanting to move to that. Now, this might sound like I'm a little naive. This might sound a little Pollyannic to some of you who have been around longer than I have. But I think something changed with Pan Am. I think that as a collective, we were pretty frustrated, no matter where you sat on the issue. I don't think we enjoyed it. I know Marie Butriani told me she got back into politics in the federal race, not thinking she would win, but because she was so frustrated with Pan Am. So that was a moment where we can learn from as a community, and we can move forward on a number of different things. So how do we build community? How do we do it in an age of social media? I want to end on this with you today. There are really 3 ways to build community. 3 of them I'm sure you're very, very familiar with, but let me apply it to what's going on now. The first way to build community has to be dialogue. Hamilton is great at that dialogue. There's none of that pseudo-community polite nonsense in this town. There has to be dialogue, and it's spirited dialogue. And whether you see it on CH Television or the Spec editorial pages or Cable 14, or if you're online and you see the fights that happen on Facebook and Twitter and the dialogue and the blogosphere, there is so much conversation in this community, and it's essential. As Rotarians, when you're looking to community programs, when you're looking to be leaders and advisors in the building of this community, you have to be engaged in that dialogue, because too often, too few people get too much airtime. We've all heard this. There are a few people who are professional activists or professional bloggers or professional letter writers. They do it, and it changes the conversation. And I'm not advocating for a particular position on anything today. I'm just saying a good community building strategy, the kind of city that Mark talked about last week, is one that requires engagement in the dialogue, even if it gets a little tough at times, even if the bullets that are being fired feel like live rounds, as Terry always said. That's important. And our council, as critical as I can be and am with them almost every Tuesday, I respect the fact that they do some things right and that they put themselves in the line of that fire, and I've said as much to them. We need to talk to them and to each other. The second point in community development that we all need to work on is education. It's not enough just to say what you feel, which is the easy part. It's bringing something new, something value-added, something that changes the discussion. You know, there was a comment made to me by one of you earlier that Mark changed their perspective on LRT because he brought new information, a new perspective, showed a compelling visual that changed somebody's mind. If we educate more, we will have more of a community to build. We will have more resources. If you go on Twitter, any of you who are part of Twitter, it's interesting, a former mayor yesterday was asked a question on Twitter by a Spectator reporter, and it ended up being a headline story on page 3. And he tweeted me and said, Laura, what is this? And I said, this is how it works. All of that, Twitter, regular television, all of it mixed. It's all one big discussion, and that's good. Takes a little getting used to, but that's good. But if you want to build community on Twitter, which is what it's called, to build followers, you have to add value. You have to educate. That's what it's all about. A little different maybe than Facebook, but they're both very important. So are you educating enough when you're reaching out to the community, when you're trying to build? Are you trying to add real value to the discussion? And the last thing that I want to leave with you on community building, especially in the new media landscape in Hamilton, is meeting people where they're at. I hadn't intended the Chats from the Lair podcast to do that. I was just wanting to reconnect with people and see what was going on. But what I realized by putting something online where people can listen to it whenever they've got time, in the car, on the bus, on the weekend, whether gardening, whatever, once I realized how that technology worked and I saw the appetite there was for those kind of discussions, it made me realize that I've been guilty too much in the past of trying to bring the audience to me, trying to do the traditional things, doesn't achieve the goal of community building, which is really engagement. To bring people together, you have to go to where they are. You have to speak to them in a way that they understand. And whether it's Rotary or one of our private clients or anything else, I leave you with the thought, think about where people are talking. Not where you're comfortable talking, not what it is that you've always done, but where they are. And if it means learning a new technology, if it means getting out of a comfort zone, that's a great thing. It was certainly out of my comfort zone to do this podcast, but I won't stop it now. It's become addictive because it feels to me like community building. And of all the places that I've had the chance to live in the world, Europe, Japan, across Canada, I have never found a community that I want to build more. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for the question. Chaos is a fundamental, necessary step to building community. You're absolutely right, and building the universe. The challenge is to move past it to the place where we can all start to work together. A little less noise, a little bit more collaboration. As I mentioned, I have had the chance to get out of town a lot, and I'm sure a lot of you do as well. Right now, even down the highway in Toronto, because of what's happening politically there, they have a mayor with a very strong, clear vision. Stop the gravy train, right? Everybody knows that one. And he's making cuts to the city budget. And what a group of citizens did using Facebook is they actually came up with an alternative budget for the city. Virtually strangers from across the community took the massive effort of building a budget for the city of Toronto. I mean, talk about a new kind of community engagement. That's just one example. When I travel to other communities, they seem to have a better sense of who they are. You know, we've always struggled, I think, with a little bit of an identity crisis in this city, mostly self-imposed. But as Marvin Ryder so beautifully explained to me the other day in a podcast, the city was something spectacular at one time. The stars aligned, if you will. People worked hard. There was a glory day in the city. And since then, there's been different declines. Things have happened. And it's hard to know where you're at when you've been one thing and you want to get somewhere else. One of the things I noted in the letter to the Spectator was that the young entrepreneurs who I've done some stuff with in town, younger than me, they don't care about the glory days of the 50s and the 60s. They really don't. And they're tired of feeling like the city is underperforming. They own it, they want to work here, they've invested their education, their career here, and they think the city is the progressive city going forward, which is inspiring to know that. They're almost visceral about that. They really insist, you know what, we don't carry that load that maybe our parents did, or that memory of going downtown shopping on a Saturday morning. That wasn't our Hamilton. Our Hamilton is something else. So what I have seen is other communities that just brand themselves better. My favorite sign of all is in Mount Forest, a tiny little town on Highway 6. Does anyone remember what that sign is? It says, "Welcome to Mount Forest, happy, healthy, and high," which is funny, but it sticks in your mind as you drive by, right? There are so many communities smaller than ours, much less important to Canada, much less beautiful, much less inspiring than Hamilton, that know who they are a little bit better. And I think as we move forward, we have to let the past go, and we have to think about what we can do. So in terms of community engagement, you've got everything from citizens doing budgets, you've got citizens deciding on what they are and making you know it as you go through their town, which is, of course, great for tourism. I've also noticed in my travels, too, Richard, that there are lots of community groups like the Summit, things like that, where groups are realizing we might have disparate viewpoints, but we have to sit down. I would say the biggest single trend that I've seen, though, is using the technology that's available. Because when you think about it, you have to have money to have cable. You have to have money to buy a Spectator. You don't have to have money with Wi-Fi to essentially go online and see what's going on. The number one communication vehicle in the world right now is the mobile phone. That's what helped with the Arab Spring Revolution. Text messaging on mobile phones is the number one communication tool on earth. And so when you're able to actually do that, there are some programs happening in Europe, actually in England, where they're putting problems that cities are facing into a computer game that you can do through a mobile text phone, and people are solving the problems like they were moving through a video game. It's fantastic. So yeah, there's lots of inspiring stuff.